Imagine walking into a church and finding dozens of people standing completely still, eyes wide open, bodies rigid as stone, frozen in positions they'd held for hours. Some stood with arms raised toward heaven, others knelt with faces pressed to the wooden floor. A few sat bolt upright in pews, mouths agape in silent screams or whispers of prayer. They didn't blink, they didn't breathe visibly. They were alive, but they weren't moving. And this wasn't some isolated incident of mass hysteria. This happened again and again, in city after city, for nearly 40 years. The woman at the center of it all? A farm girl from Ohio named Maria Woodworth Etter. And what happened in her meetings would eventually help shape modern Pentecostalism while terrifying entire communities in the process. The first time it happened, even Maria herself didn't understand it. It was 1885, and she was holding a revival meeting in a small Ohio town. She'd been preaching with unusual intensity that night, her voice rising and falling like thunder and whispers, when suddenly a young woman in the front row went completely still. Her eyes remained open, staring at something no one else could see. Minutes passed, then an hour. The woman didn't move. People tried to wake her, shaking her shoulders, calling her name. Nothing. She was like a statue carved from flesh. Within the same service, others began to fall into similar states. A farmer stood up from his seat and froze mid-step, 1 foot raised, arms outstretched. He stayed that way for 3 hours. A mother collapsed to her knees and remained there, hands clasped in prayer, for the entire night. By morning, when she finally came to, she could barely walk. Her legs had locked in position. The marks on her knees lasted for days. This became Maria Woodworth Etter's trademark. Wherever she went, people fell into what she called trances under the power of God. But to observers, especially those who didn't share her religious fervor, it looked like something far more sinister. It looked like mass hypnosis, like spiritual manipulation, like something deeply, disturbingly wrong. Maria Woodworth Etter wasn't supposed to be a preacher. Born in 1844 in rural Ohio, she grew up in poverty, married young, and lost 5 of her 6 children to illness before they reached adulthood. The grief nearly destroyed her, but somewhere in that darkness she claimed to hear a voice, a divine calling to preach the gospel. This was unthinkable for a woman in the 1880s. Respectable churches didn't ordain women. Female preachers were considered scandalous at best, blasphemous at worst. But Maria didn't care about respectability. She believed God had chosen her for something extraordinary, something that would shake the foundations of American Christianity. And she was right, though not in the way anyone expected. She began holding tent revivals across the Midwest, and from the very beginning, strange things happened. People didn't just convert at her meetings, they fell. They screamed. They spoke in languages no one recognized. They had visions of heaven and hell so vivid they could describe them in photographic detail. And most unsettling of all, they froze. Witnesses described the trances in chilling detail. Medical doctors were sometimes called to examine the frozen congregants, and their findings were disturbing. Pulse rates were often undetectable. Breathing became so shallow it was nearly imperceptible. Body temperature dropped. In some cases, people remained in these states for hours, even days. One woman allegedly stayed in a trance for 9 days, lying on a cot in the church, while hundreds came to stare at her like a museum exhibit. What did they experience during these trances? According to those who emerged from them, they had been transported, pulled out of their bodies and taken on journeys through the spiritual realm. Some claimed to have seen deceased loved ones. Others described crossing rivers of fire, walking through cities of gold, or standing before throne rooms of terrible beauty. A few spoke of darker visions, of being shown the torments of hell, of witnessing demons, of feeling themselves dangling over an abyss of eternal suffering. The psychological impact was profound. People came out of these trances changed. Some became radical converts, abandoning their former lives entirely to follow Maria's ministry. Others were traumatized, haunted by what they'd seen. A few never fully recovered, spending the rest of their lives in and out of mental institutions, their minds apparently shattered by whatever had happened to them during those frozen hours. Not everyone saw this as the work of God. Newspapers across the country ran sensational headlines: hypnotic evangelist entrances victims, mass hysteria grips revival meetings. Is she a prophet or a fraud? Local authorities often tried to shut down her meetings. Doctors warned that she was inducing dangerous psychological states. Ministers from established churches denounced her as a charlatan, or worse, as an agent of demonic forces. In Oakland, California in 1990, her meetings became so controversial that city officials threatened to arrest her. Thousands packed the tent anyway, curious to witness the phenomenon for themselves. And they weren't disappointed. That night, dozens fell into trances simultaneously. The sight was described as both beautiful and terrifying. Rows of people standing frozen, faces glowing with rapture or contorted in spiritual ecstasy, while Maria walked among them, praying over each one, her own face pale and intense. The tent meetings became like circuses of the supernatural. People bought tickets. Newspaper reporters attended to document the spectacle. Skeptics came to debunk her. Believers came seeking miracles. And almost inevitably, someone, sometimes many, would freeze. What's particularly unsettling when you examine the historical records is the power Maria Woodworth Etter wielded over her followers. She wasn't just a preacher, she became a spiritual authority figure whose word was treated as direct revelation from God. If she said someone was in a divine trance, who could argue? If she claimed that the visions people experienced were genuine supernatural events, who had the authority to contradict her? This created an environment where normal skepticism was suppressed. People who might have questioned what was happening were afraid to speak up, fearing they were resisting God himself. Those who fell into trances and reported terrifying visions were told this was spiritual warfare, a sign they were on the right path. The psychological manipulation, whether intentional or not, was profound. And there's evidence that Maria actively cultivated these states. Former attendees later reported that she would prime the audience before meetings, telling them to expect manifestations of the Holy Spirit, describing in vivid detail what they might experience. She created anticipation, expectation, a kind of spiritual permission structure that made people more susceptible to entering altered states of consciousness. Modern psychologists and neurologists have studied accounts of Maria Woodworth Etter's meetings, and their conclusions are sobering. What she was likely inducing was a form of dissociative trance, a state where the mind essentially disconnects from normal sensory processing and bodily control. This can happen through a combination of factors: intense emotional arousal, repetitive auditory stimulation like rhythmic preaching, expectation and suggestion, group dynamics, and sometimes physical exhaustion. In religious contexts, people experiencing these states genuinely believe they're having supernatural experiences. The visions feel absolutely real because the brain is creating them using the same neural pathways that process actual sensory information. The paralysis happens because the motor cortex essentially goes offline, leaving the person frozen in whatever position they held when the trance state was induced. This doesn't mean everyone was faking. Most people in these trances were having authentic psychological experiences. They just weren't necessarily divine in origin. But the line between a legitimate altered state of consciousness and dangerous psychological manipulation is razor thin. And Maria Woodworth Etter walked that line for decades. Not all of the stories from Maria's meetings have happy endings. There are documented cases of people suffering serious physical harm from extended periods of immobility. Circulation problems, muscle damage, dehydration, these were real medical consequences. At least one person reportedly died after remaining in a trance state for too long, though the exact circumstances were hushed up by Maria's organization. There are also troubling accounts of vulnerable people, those already struggling with mental illness, being pushed into deeper psychological crises by these experiences. A young man in Indiana entered a trance during one of Maria's services and emerged convinced he was the reincarnation of John the Baptist. He abandoned his family, wandered into the wilderness, and was never seen again. Was Maria directly responsible? Perhaps not, but the environment she created certainly contributed to the tragedy. Maria Woodworth Etter died in 1924, but her influence didn't die with her. She became a foundational figure in the Pentecostal movement, which today claims over 280 million adherents worldwide. The phenomena she popularized, speaking in tongues, being slain in the spirit, prophetic trances, are now standard features of charismatic Christianity. Modern megachurch services often feature similar manifestations, though usually in more controlled, less extreme forms. But here's what's rarely discussed: the potential psychological harm of these practices. When spiritual experiences are treated as unquestionable divine manifestations, when altered states of consciousness are induced in group settings without proper safeguards, when vulnerable people are told that their terrifying visions are messages from God, the potential for manipulation and trauma is enormous. The story of Maria Woodworth Etter forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about faith, psychology, and power. Were the people who froze in her meetings experiencing genuine encounters with the divine, or were they victims of masterful psychological manipulation, entranced by a charismatic leader who may not have fully understood or cared about the power she wielded over vulnerable minds? Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is that we may never know for certain. The frozen congregants are long dead, the tent meetings are historical footnotes, but the practice continues in various forms, in churches and revival meetings around the world, where people still fall into trances, still stand frozen like statues, still claim to have been transported to other realms. And each time it happens, we're left wondering, is this the fingerprint of God touching human consciousness, or is it something darker? The dangerous intersection of faith, suggestion, and the human mind's terrifying susceptibility to manipulation. The statues in Maria Woodworth Etter's meetings eventually moved again. They woke up, they went home, but they were never quite the same. And perhaps that's the haunting legacy of all, the thousands of lives permanently altered by a woman who claimed to speak for God, who turned worship services into theaters of the supernatural, who made believers out of skeptics and statues out of people. The question that remains is simple but profound.